The air in Oakhaven always tasted of damp earth and wood smoke, a comforting blend that clung to Alara's wool tunic like a second skin. It was the scent of home, of a life etched into the rhythm of the seasons, dictated by the forest at her back and the whispering creek at her feet. This afternoon, however, a third scent joined the mix, the metallic tang of an approaching storm. The sky, once a brilliant, placid blue, was now bruised with shades of gray and purple, the clouds churning like a pot of simmering water. The wind, usually a gentle caress through the oak leaves, now whipped at her hair, carrying with it a chill that promised rain, and a great deal of it. Alara knelt at the creek's edge, her hands plunging into the cold, clear water as she scrubbed a linen shirt against a smooth, flat stone. The current was already stronger than usual, tugging at the fabric with impatient fingers. She should have been finished hours ago, but her neighbor, Old Fen, had taken a fall, and she'd spent the morning helping his wife, Maeve, reset the bone in his wrist and prepare a poultice of comfrey and willow bark. It was the way of things in Oakhaven. A neighbor's trouble was everyone's trouble. Most of the other women had already gathered their washing and hurried back to the warmth of their hearths, their voices carried away by the rising wind. Alara was alone, a small figure against a vast, brooding landscape. She worked quickly, her knuckles red from the cold, her mind on the stew she planned to make for dinner. A sudden crack of thunder, closer this time, made her flinch. The first heavy drops of rain began to splatter against the stones around her, dark circles spreading on the pale gray rock. It was time to go. As she bundled the damp linens into her basket, a movement on the opposite bank caught her eye. It was a figure, stumbling through the dense thicket of ferns and brambles that bordered the forest. They moved with a desperate, frantic energy that was jarringly out of place in the steady calm of the village. For a moment, Alara thought it might be one of the hunters, perhaps Borin, returning late from his traps. But the silhouette was wrong. Softer, smaller, it was a woman. The stranger burst from the tree line and staggered towards the water, her gaze fixed on the village. She was not dressed for the wilderness. Her clothes, though torn and smeared with mud, were of a cut and fabric Alara had never seen before, a deep forest green that was finer than any wool dyed in Oakhaven. Her hair, a cascade of dark auburn, was matted with leaves and twigs. She was hurt. She favored one leg, and one arm was held tight against her chest as if protecting a wound. When she looked up, her face was a pale oval of exhaustion and sheer terror. Her eyes met Alara's across the rushing water. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The creek, no longer whispering, was beginning to roar. What had been a manageable current an hour ago was now a churning, debris-strewn torrent. The woman on the other side took a hesitant step into the water, and the force of it nearly swept her off her feet. She cried out, a sound of pure despair that was almost lost in the wind's howl. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct, every lesson taught by the cautious elders of Oakhaven, screamed at her to turn away. Strangers meant trouble. They brought sickness or violence or the unwanted attention of the world beyond the forest. Helping was a risk, a foolish one, and the river itself was a death trap, but the woman's eyes held her. They were wide with a terror so profound it transcended caution. It was the look of a hunted animal, cornered and with nowhere left to run. Alara saw not a stranger, but a person on the brink of being consumed. Before she could second-guess herself, she dropped her basket. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice thin against the storm's growing symphony. "The current is too strong. Stay there." The woman either didn't hear or was too desperate to listen. She took another clumsy step into the creek, and this time she went under, disappearing for a terrifying second before her head broke the surface, coughing and sputtering. She was going to drown. In that moment, something shifted in Alara. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, undeniable resolve. She kicked off her worn leather shoes, her bare feet sinking into the muddy bank. She looked back towards the forest path one last time and saw him. Borin. He stood half hidden by the trunk of an ancient oak, his bow unslung at his side, his face a mask of stone. He had been watching, How long, she didn't know. He made no move to help, nor to stop her. He just watched, his presence a silent, heavy judgment. Alara turned back to the river. There was no more time for thought. She waded in, the icy shock of the water stealing her breath. It was a struggle for every step, the powerful current pushing against her legs, trying to knock her down. Stones, sharp and slick with algae, rolled under her feet. She fixed her eyes on the floundering woman, who was now clinging to a half-submerged log, her strength clearly failing. "I'm coming," Alara yelled, fighting her way to the center of the creek where the water was deepest, rising to her waist. The force was immense, a physical manifestation of the storm's fury. She reached the log, her fingers scrabbling for a hold. Her hand found the woman's. It was freezing cold, limp, but it tightened around hers with a desperate, surprising strength. "Hold on to me," Alara gasped, pulling with all her might. The woman was a dead weight, her body battered and exhausted. Together, they were a fragile anchor in the raging water. Alara began the slow, arduous journey back, moving sideways, planting her feet with deliberate care, her arm locked with the stranger's. The woman's head lolled against her shoulder, her breathing ragged and shallow. She was barely conscious. Finally, her foot found the muddy shallows of the near bank. With a final, agonizing heave, she dragged them both from the water's grip, collapsing onto the wet grass, shivering uncontrollably. The rain was falling in earnest now, a torrential downpour that soaked them to the bone in seconds. The stranger's eyes fluttered open, a flicker of awareness in their depths. A single word escaped her lips, a whisper so faint Alara almost missed it. "Thank you." Then her eyes rolled back and she went limp. Alara looked up towards the forest. Boren was gone. The space where he had stood was empty, as if he had been a phantom conjured by the storm. But she knew he had been there. She was alone now, with the rain, the roaring creek, and an unconscious, unknown woman at her side. Shaking with cold and adrenaline, she gathered her strength, hauled the stranger into her arms, and began the slow, heavy walk to her cottage at the edge of the village, leaving her basket and the linens to be claimed by the river. The storm raged against the small cottage, a wild beast clawing at the windows and roaring down the stone chimney. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the hearth and the shallow, ragged breaths of the stranger. Alara had managed to peel away the woman's sodden, dark green tunic, a fabric finer and softer than anything she had ever felt. It wasn't homespun wool or rough linen. It felt alien, smooth as river stones under her calloused fingers. She worked by the flickering firelight, gently cleaning the gash on the woman's temple and the deep scrapes along her arms. The woman was lean but strong, her hands surprisingly unblemished, save for the injuries. They were not the hands of a farmer or a craftswoman. They were the hands of someone who held pens, or perhaps something else entirely. Alara wrung out a cloth in a basin of warm water infused with yarrow and comfrey, herbs her grandmother had taught her to use for wounds and fevers. As she dabbed at a cut on the woman's forearm, she noticed a faint, silver-white scar tracing the line of a vein, almost invisible unless the light caught it just so. It wasn't a scar from an accident. It was too precise, too deliberate. A knot of unease tightened in Alara's stomach, a feeling colder than the rain lashing at the door. Every detail about this woman was a question without an answer. She had saved a life, but what else had she invited into her home? For hours, she sat vigil, stoking the fire and listening. The stranger tossed in her fevered sleep, muttering words in a cadence Alara didn't recognize. Sharp, clipped sounds that were not the lilting, nature-worn dialect of Oakhaven. Just before the first hint of dawn, when the storm had quieted to a mournful sigh, the woman's eyes snapped open. They were a startlingly pale gray, like the winter sky, and they held no softness, only a sharp, cornered animal awareness. Her hand shot out, grabbing Alara's wrist with surprising strength. "Where am I?" The voice was a hoarse whisper, but it held an undeniable edge of command. Alara didn't pull away. She kept her own voice low and steady, the way one would with a frightened deer. "You're safe. My name is Alara. I found you by the Whispering Creek. You were hurt." The woman's eyes darted around the small, single-room cottage, taking in the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the simple wooden furniture, the loom in the corner. Her gaze lingered on the locked wooden door before returning to Alara. The grip on her wrist loosened slightly. "The creek, I remember the water." She swallowed, her throat dry. "Thank you." It was not an expression of heartfelt gratitude, but a simple statement of fact. She pushed herself up, wincing as her muscles protested. "I need to leave." "You can't," Alara said, more firmly this time. "The storm has passed, but the creek will be impassable for another day at least. Besides, you're weak, you have a fever." She gestured to the empty bowl. "I made you broth, you need to eat. Rest." The woman studied Alara's face, her expression unreadable, calculating. There was a long silence, broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves. Finally, she gave a slow, reluctant nod and sank back against the straw-stuffed mattress. "Lyra," she said. "My name is Lyra." She offered nothing more, and Alara didn't ask. An unspoken understanding settled between them. Sanctuary was being given, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, the world outside was scrubbed clean and unnervingly quiet. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Alara was mending Lyra's tunic when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the cottage. It was a knock she knew well. Lyra, who had been silently watching the fire, instantly tensed, her eyes locking onto the door like a hawk spotting its prey. "Stay back," Alara whispered, placing a reassuring hand on her arm before moving to the door. She drew the bolt and opened it a crack. Maeve stood on her doorstep, the village elder, her face etched with the lines of 70 winters and a deep, unyielding concern for her community. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, as sharp as ever, were fixed on Alara. "Boren saw you last night, child," Maeve began, her voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "He said you pulled someone from the creek, a stranger." Alara's heart sank. She had hoped for more time. "She was injured, Maeve. She would have died." "Our ways exist for a reason, Alara. We are safe because we are separate. The world beyond Oakhaven is not kind. What trouble have you brought into this valley? Who is she?" Behind her, Alara could feel Lyra's stillness, a coiled spring of tension. She chose her words carefully, shielding the interior of the cottage with her body. "Her name is Lyra. She is just a woman who was caught in the storm. She means no harm." "You don't know that," Maeve countered, her gaze unwavering. "You know only what you see, and you see with too soft a heart. That is your gift and your weakness. The council will need to speak with this, Lyra. When she is well enough to walk, you will bring her to the meeting hall. We will decide if she can stay or if she must go." It was not a request. It was an order. Maeve's eyes flickered past Alara for a fraction of a second, trying to catch a glimpse of the person who was now the subject of the entire village's attention. But she saw nothing. "I understand," Alara said, her voice betraying none of the defiance brewing within her. Maeve gave a curt nod and turned, her stout figure retreating down the muddy path. Alara closed the door, her back resting against the solid wood. The quiet sanctuary of her home now felt like a cage. She turned to face Lyra, who was now standing, her posture rigid. The fear from the night before was gone, replaced by a steely resolve that seemed to emanate from her very bones. "They want to judge me," Lyra stated. It wasn't a question. "They are cautious," Alara corrected gently. "This is a small village. Strangers are an event." Lyra walked to the small table and picked up the half-mended tunic, her fingers tracing the fine stitching Alara had done. "You stood up for me," she said, her voice soft, almost surprised. "Against your elder." "I did what was right," Alara replied simply, beginning to clear away the breakfast bowls. A comfortable quiet fell between them, different from the tense silence of before. Lyra watched her for a moment, then picked up a spare cloth and began to dry the wooden bowls as Alara washed them. It was a small, simple gesture, but in the charged atmosphere of the cottage, it felt monumental. It was an act of partnership, a silent acknowledgement that they were now in this together. Outside, the village whispered and waited, but inside, a fragile and unlikely alliance had just been forged. The storm had passed, but the air in Oakhaven remained heavy, charged with a different kind of electricity. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of the village, mirroring the suspicion that now clung to Alara. In the days that followed Maeve's visit, a palpable chill settled over her interactions with her neighbors. It wasn't overt aggression, but something more insidious. A quiet turning of backs at the village well, a sudden silence falling over a conversation when she approached the market stall, the way mothers pulled their children a little closer as she passed. It was a cold, quiet ostracization, and Alara felt it sting with every step. She knew Boren was the source. She'd see him across the village green, leaning against the ancient oak, his arms crossed. He wasn't shouting or making a scene. He was worse. He spoke in low, reasonable tones to small groups of men, his expression one of grave concern. He was poisoning the well of community not with venom, but with carefully measured drops of fear. He spoke of prudence, of protecting their way of life, of the unknown dangers a stranger could bring. He made their fear sound like wisdom, and their suspicions sound like a virtue. Inside the cottage, the world shrank to the four walls, the crackling hearth, and the two women within. The space became a sanctuary against the silent judgment outside. Lyra's physical wounds were healing well. The angry gash on her arm was closing, and the deep bruises on her ribs were fading from a violent purple to a mottled yellow-green. Alara tended to them with gentle, practiced hands, changing dressings, and applying salves made from comfrey and yarrow. It was during these quiet moments that Alara tried, delicately, to breach the walls Lyra had built around herself. "The council will want to know where you came from," Alara said softly one afternoon, dabbing a clean cloth against Lyra's arm. "Anything you can tell me might help them understand. They fear what they don't know." Lyra's gaze was distant, fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. Her hands, resting in her lap, clenched into tight fists. "Knowing won't make them less afraid," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes, knowing makes it worse." "What are they afraid of knowing, Lyra?" Alara pressed, her tone laced with a gentle urgency. Lyra finally turned to look at her, and in her eyes, Alara saw a flicker of the same hunted terror she'd seen at the riverbank. "They're afraid of the people I'm running from. They should be." She paused, a shiver running through her despite the warmth of the fire. "They don't stop. They follow the scent of what's been left behind. They take what they want, and they burn the rest." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a story that had been stripped of all meaning through sheer, brutal repetition. It was more chilling than any scream. That was all she offered. Cryptic fragments that painted a terrifying picture without offering any solid details. It was enough to deepen Alara's resolve, but she knew it wouldn't be enough for the council. It wasn't a defense, it was a threat. The inevitable confrontation with Boren happened 3 days before the council meeting. Alara was returning from the woods, her basket filled with late-season mushrooms, when he stepped out from behind a thicket of birch trees, blocking her path. He wasn't carrying his bow, but he seemed just as dangerous. "You're a fool, Alara," he said, his voice low and cutting. He dispensed with any pretense of neighborly concern. "You've always been too soft. Seeing a stray cat, a bird with a broken wing, you can't help yourself. But this isn't a wounded animal you've brought into your home. It's a wolf." Alara clutched the handle of her basket, her knuckles white. "She's a woman who was drowning. I did what anyone should have done." "No," Boren countered, taking a step closer. His shadow fell over her. "You did what you would do. The rest of us know that survival sometimes means letting the river claim what belongs to it. You've put us all at risk for your feeling, for your sentiment." He spat the word out as if it tasted foul. Alara's chin lifted. A fire she didn't know she possessed began to burn in her chest, pushing back against the cold dread. "And what would you have done, Boren? Watched her die? Is that the kind of village you want to live in? One where we let people die on our doorstep because we're afraid? I want to live in a safe village," he shot back, his voice rising. "Her words are poison. I hear she speaks of people who burn everything. She's bringing her war to our home, Alara, and you opened the door and invited it in for a cup of tea. If there is a war, Alara said, her voice steady and clear. "It's because people like you choose fear over compassion. I'm not afraid of her. I'm afraid of what we become if we turn our backs on her." She sidestepped him and walked away, not looking back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt his eyes on her back the entire way to her cottage, a heavy, judgmental weight. When she stepped inside, shaking slightly, Lyra was standing by the window, having clearly witnessed the exchange. She didn't say a word. Instead, she walked over, took the heavy basket from Alara's trembling hand, and set it on the table. Then, she picked up the knife and began to clean the mushrooms with a quiet, focused efficiency. The simple, domestic act was a message of solidarity, an acknowledgement of the battle Alara had just fought on her behalf. In that shared silence, their fragile alliance solidified into something stronger. They were two women, isolated and cornered, with only each other to rely on. On the eve of the council meeting, a tense quiet fell over the cottage. The fire crackled, the wind whispered outside, and the entire village seemed to be holding its breath. Alara watched Lyra, who had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep in the chair by the hearth, her face, even in slumber, etched with weariness. Tomorrow, they would face the village. And Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that whatever happened in that meeting, Oakhaven would never be the same again. The Great Hall of Oakhaven felt less like a shelter and more like a tomb. Built from the oldest and darkest timbers in the valley, its high, smoke-stained rafters seemed to absorb the light from the flickering oil lamps and the large central fire pit, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted faces into menacing masks. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and the collective anxiety of 100 people packed into a space meant for half that number. Every bench was full, and villagers stood 3 deep along the walls, their gazes fixed on the raised platform at the far end. Alara felt the weight of their eyes like a physical pressure. She walked beside Lyra, her posture straight and her chin held high, though a tremor ran through her hands. She had insisted they walk in together, not as accused and accuser, but as allies. Lyra, for her part, was a portrait of strained composure. Her face was pale, but her eyes, dark and watchful, missed nothing. She moved with a deliberate grace, her injured arm cradled against her chest, a silent testament to the violence she had escaped. The murmuring ceased as they reached the front, a wave of silence rippling through the hall. On the platform sat Maeve, her face etched with the gravity of her position. Flanked by 2 other village elders, grim and silent men, she looked every bit the matriarch holding the fate of her people in her hands. To her right, standing with his arms crossed, was Borin. He gave Alara a look that was not of triumph, but of somber, righteous certainty. He truly believed he was saving them all. "The council is called to order," Maeve's voice cut through the stillness, clear and authoritative. "We are here to address a matter of great importance to the safety and stability of Oakhaven. Alara, daughter of Fenris, has brought a stranger into our midst. An act of compassion, she claims. An act of recklessness, others fear." Maeve's gaze settled on Borin. "Borin has asked to speak. He will be heard." Borin stepped forward, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the wooden planks. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke with the calm, pragmatic cadence of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. "Elders, neighbors," he began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "For generations, we have survived because we are careful. We know these woods. We know our borders. We know that the world beyond them is not always kind. We have built this peace with vigilance." He gestured toward Lyra, not with accusation, but as if presenting evidence. This woman appeared from a storm, injured, with no explanation. She wears clothes of a finer make than any here. She carries wounds from a fight, not a fall. She is a mystery, and mystery is a shadow in which danger likes to hide. He paused, letting his words sink in. Alara's heart is good. We all know this. But a good heart can be a liability when it blinds you to threats. By bringing this stranger here, she has punched a hole in our shield. Who follows her? Who seeks her? What trouble has she brought to our doorstep? We cannot risk the safety of our children, the security of our homes, for one person we do not know. I ask the council to do the wise thing, the safe thing. Send her away. Let her trouble be her own." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Elara felt her stomach tighten. Boren's logic was a poison, simple and effective, preying on their deepest fears. "Elara," Maeve said, her voice even. "You may speak." Elara took a deep breath, stepping forward to stand beside Lyra. "I will not apologize for saving a life," she said, her voice shaking slightly at first, but gaining strength with every word. "I saw a woman drowning. I did not see a stranger or a threat. I saw a human being in need of help. Is that not the foundation of a community, to help one another?" She looked out at the faces, some hostile, some uncertain, a few sympathetic. "Boren speaks of safety. But what is a safety that requires us to be cruel? What is a peace that is built on turning our backs on suffering? That is not strength. That is fear. And a village ruled by fear is already lost. If we send her away, we are saying that our lives are worth more than hers. And if we believe that, what stops us from turning on each other when times get hard? What if it were one of you washed up on that riverbank? Would you want to be met with suspicion or with a helping hand?" Her words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the fearful logic that had taken hold. A tense silence followed before Maeve turned her gaze to the still silent woman at the center of it all. "You have heard the arguments," Maeve said to Lyra, her tone softening slightly. "But we have not heard from you. Who are you, and what trouble do you bring?" This was the moment. The air grew thick, every person leaning forward. Lyra looked at Elara, a quick, reassuring glance before turning to face Maeve. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried a resonance that commanded attention. "My name is Lyra," she said, her gaze steady. "And Boren is right. I do bring trouble." A gasp went through the crowd. Boren's expression hardened, Elara's heart sank. "I am fleeing a man," Lyra continued, her voice unwavering. "His name is Kalen. He leads a clan of warriors from the Northern Territories. He is a powerful man, a cruel man." She touched her bandaged arm. "He did this. He believes I possess something that belongs to him. He will not stop searching until he finds me." She scanned the faces in the hall, letting them see the exhaustion and fear she had held back for so long. "I did not ask to bring this danger to you. I was trying to get away, to disappear where he could not follow. The river, it was a miscalculation. I never intended to be a burden on anyone." Her voice cracked with emotion for the first time. "Elara saved my life. Whatever you decide, that is a debt I can never repay. But I will not lie to you. To shelter me is to risk Kalen's wrath." The hall erupted in frightened chatter. Lyra had confirmed their worst fears, but she had done so with a disarming honesty that threw the entire room into a moral crisis. She was not a shadowy threat. She was a named victim, hunted by a specific monster. Maeve slammed her hand on the wooden table. "Silence!" The room quieted instantly. The elders on the platform leaned in, whispering fiercely to Maeve. Boren watched, his jaw tight, his argument validated, but the path forward now horribly complicated. To cast her out now felt less like prudence and more like a death sentence. Finally, Maeve straightened, her face a mask of weary resolution. "The council has decided," she announced, her voice echoing in the profound silence. "Lyra, you have been honest with us, and your honesty has earned you a chance. You may stay in Oakhaven." A sigh of relief escaped Elara's lips, but Maeve held up a hand, silencing any reaction. "But this is not without conditions," she continued, her eyes locking with Lyra's. "You are confined to the village. You will work under Elara's supervision to earn your keep and contribute to this community. We will shelter you. But, and let this be understood by all, if this Kalen, or even one of his men, is seen near our lands, this agreement is void. You will be handed over to them to ensure the survival of Oakhaven." She then turned her steely gaze on Elara. "And you, Elara, as her sponsor, you will be responsible. Your fate will be tied to hers." The verdict settled over the room like a shroud. It was not a victory, but a stay of execution. A fragile, terrifying truce. Elara looked at Lyra, seeing not relief in her friend's eyes, but the grim understanding of a shared burden. They had survived the council. but they were now prisoners together, waiting for a storm far greater than the one that had brought them together. Before the storm, before the stranger, life in Oak Haven moved with the steady, predictable rhythm of a deep and quiet breath. The village was a secret tucked away by the ancient forest, cradled in a valley and guarded by the unyielding mountains to the east. To the west, its boundary was the Whispering Creek, a line drawn by nature that had, over generations, become an inviolable law. The water was Oak Haven's wall, its moat, its final word on the matter of the outside world. And the outside world, as every child was taught, was filled with chaos, hunger, and broken promises. The air smelled of pine resin, damp earth, and the comforting scent of wood smoke from the cottage chimneys. It was a place of deep roots, both for the towering oaks that gave the village its name and for the families who lived there. Life was hard but simple. You tended the crops, hunted the woods, mended the fences, and above all, you trusted your own. Elara felt this rhythm in her bones, yet a small part of her had always moved to a slightly different beat. This morning, like most, she was by the creek, her basket filled with river moss and willow bark for her poultices. She was the village's unofficial healer of small wounds and fevers, a role she inherited from her mother. While others saw the creek as a menacing border, Elara saw a place of life. She watched the sunlight dance on the currents, mesmerized by its endless journey to places she could only imagine. Her attention was caught by a flicker of movement near the reeds. A fawn, no bigger than a house cat, bleating pitifully. It had been separated from its mother by a small, fast-moving channel that fed into the main creek. The doe stood on the other side, frantic. Any other villager would have seen it as the wilderness being itself, cruel and indifferent. But Elara couldn't turn away. Setting her basket down, she waded into the cold water, her skirt soaking instantly. She moved slowly, calming the fawn with a low hum, and gently guided the trembling creature back across the channel and onto the bank, where it darted immediately to its mother's side. The doe gave a grateful flick of her tail before vanishing into the undergrowth. Elara smiled, a private, simple joy. It was then she felt a presence behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Boren's silence was as distinct as any man's voice. He stood at the edge of the woods, his bow unslung, his face carved with the grim focus of a man who saw threats in every shadow. He was Oak Haven's best hunter, its protector, and he carried that responsibility like a physical weight on his broad shoulders. He had seen her act of kindness. "A kind heart is a heavy burden in these woods, Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact, a piece of his rigid worldview. "It was just a fawn, Boren," she replied, wringing the water from her skirt. "It was helpless." "Everything is helpless until it isn't," he countered, his eyes scanning the opposite bank of the creek, a habit as ingrained as breathing. "That stream is getting faster. The autumn rains are coming early this year." He gestured with his chin towards the water. "The Whispering Creek will be a roar soon. It's for the best. It keeps us safe." Elara looked at the water. "You see a wall," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Sometimes, I think I see a path." Boren's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. To him, her words were a form of youthful foolishness, a dangerous crack in the village's foundation of security. "There are no paths that lead to good things from here, Elara, only endings. Remember the stories." He gave a curt nod and was gone, melting back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. Later that evening, the village gathered around the central fire pit as the last light bled from the sky. The air grew cooler, and families shared bread and smoked meat, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. It was then that Elder Maeve, her face a roadmap of Oak Haven's history, began her story. Her voice, though thin with age, held an unshakable authority. "In the year of the fallen star winter," she began, and every child fell silent. "The snows were so deep that the forest went silent. We were starving. A man appeared on the far bank of the creek, half frozen, begging for shelter." Elara had heard the tale 100 times. It was their founding myth, their justification. Maeve told of how the elders of that time, moved by pity, had helped the man cross. They gave him food and warmth, and in return, he waited until they slept, stole their winter stores, and fled, leaving them to face a season of terrible loss. 2 children and an elder died before the spring thaw. Pity is a luxury we cannot afford, Maeve concluded, her eyes finding each villager in the firelight. Our survival was bought with a hard lesson. We do not look outside. We do not listen to promises from across the water. We are Oakhaven, and we are enough. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. The story worked its magic once again, reinforcing the walls of fear that kept them safe, that kept them isolated. Elara looked at the wide, frightened eyes of the children and felt a familiar, quiet ache of dissent. It felt less like a lesson in safety and more like a cage built from old sorrow. Back in the solitude of her cottage, the scent of drying herbs a comfort, Elara sat by her window. She stared out into the darkness. In the direction of the creek she could hear but not see. The wind began to howl, a low and mournful sound that rattled the wooden shutters. In the far distance, the western sky flashed with a silent, bruised light. A storm was gathering, a great, tumultuous force moving in from the unknown world beyond the water. The peace of Oakhaven was about to be tested, and the first raindrop, like a fateful knock on the door, was about to fall. The air in the valley hung thick and heavy, a damp blanket smelling of pine needles and impending rain. Oakhaven, nestled deep within the embrace of the Appalachian foothills, had always felt insulated from the outside world. A sanctuary carved out of the wilderness by generations who knew that survival was a harsh, unforgiving pact. The towering oaks and jagged ridges weren't just geography. They were walls, and the whispering creek that snaked through the valley floor was its moat. For the people of Oakhaven, this isolation was not a curse, but a sacred promise of security. Elara felt the weight of that promise every day. As she moved along the creek's edge, her linen satchel filling with willow bark and comfrey root, she felt the familiar dichotomy that defined her existence, a deep love for her home and a quiet chafing against its rigid rules. Her fingers, stained green from crushed leaves, worked with a practiced gentleness. She was a healer, taught by her grandmother to see life in everything, the resilience of a weed pushing through packed earth, the quiet strength of a tree bending in the wind. But in Oakhaven, life was a resource, and compassion was a luxury often deemed too expensive. The creek murmured secrets to itself, its waters running clear and shallow over smooth stones. But Elara could see the signs. The sky to the west was bruising, a deep, sullen purple that swallowed the blue. The birds were silent, and the air had a strange, electric stillness. A storm was coming, a big one, the kind that could turn the gentle creek into a churning, violent beast. Finding weeds, Elara, the voice, low and rough like grinding stones, startled her. She turned to see Borin leaning against a thick sycamore, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was Oakhaven's best hunter, and in many ways, the embodiment of its spirit. His face was a map of hard-won experience, his eyes sharp and perpetually scanning for threats. He saw the world in terms of predator and prey, of strength and weakness. He saw Elara's gentle work as a quaint, almost dangerous indulgence. "They're not weeds, Borin. They're medicine," she replied, her voice soft but firm. She refused to be intimidated by his grim demeanor. "For old man Hemlock's cough," Borin grunted, pushing himself off the tree. He took a step closer, his heavy boots making little sound on the soft earth. "The only medicine this valley needs is vigilance. A storm's brewing. You shouldn't be out here alone." His gaze wasn't on the sky, but on the far side of the creek, towards the narrow path that was the only way into Oakhaven from the outside world. "The plants don't wait for the weather to be convenient," Elara said, tying the top of her satchel. "And I'm not afraid of a little rain." "It's not the rain I'm worried about," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Storms wash things ashore. Unwanted things, desperate things." His xenophobia was as much a part of him as the hunting knife at his belt. The village's history was punctuated by cautionary tales of outsiders bringing blight, disease, or violence. These stories were told around the fire pits, lessons drilled into children from the moment they could understand. Strangers were a disruption to the delicate balance of their existence. To Boren, they were an infection. "Everything is desperate when it's fighting to survive," Alara murmured, more to herself than to him. She looked at his hands, calloused and capable, hands that could field dress a deer in minutes, but would never know the delicate touch required to set a broken bone without causing more pain. He caught her gaze and seemed to understand its meaning. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps a sliver of defensiveness, crossed his features. "Your sentimentality will be the death of you, Alara. You look at a wounded fox and see a creature in need of mending. I see a carrier of rabies that could poison our dogs and threaten our children. We see the same world, but you refuse to accept its harshness." He turned without another word and strode back toward the village, his silhouette a stark, unyielding line against the darkening woods. Alara watched him go, a familiar ache in her chest. He wasn't wrong, not entirely. Oakhaven had survived because of men like Boren, because of its suspicion and its walls, both real and imagined. But what was the point of survival, she wondered, if you sacrificed the very things that made life worth living? What was a community without compassion? As she walked back, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, dotting the dusty path. Villagers hurried between the sturdy log cabins, securing shutters and bringing in livestock from the common pasture. Faces were grim, focused. She saw Elder Maeve standing on the porch of the Great Hall, her long gray braid hanging over one shoulder, her eyes on the churning clouds. Maeve was the keeper of their laws, the bridge between Oakhaven's past and its future. Her expression was as stern and unreadable as the stone carvings that decorated the hall's entrance. Alara gave a respectful nod, which Maeve returned with a slow, deliberate dip of her head. It was a look that held both acknowledgement and warning. It said, "I see you, girl. I know your heart. Do not let it lead this village to ruin." Reaching her small cottage at the edge of the village, Alara felt a profound sense of isolation. Here, amidst her own people, she felt like an outsider. She unpacked her herbs, the familiar scents filling her small home, but they brought little comfort. The wind began to howl, rattling the wooden frame of her window. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a relentless, deafening roar. Instead of hunkering down by her hearth, Alara found herself drawn to the window, her gaze fixed on the path leading to the Whispering Creek. The world outside was a gray, blurry torrent. Boren's words echoed in her mind. Storms wash things ashore, unwanted things, desperate things. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a strange, anxious premonition. She felt a pull toward the creek, an inexplicable sense that the storm was bringing more than just wind and water. It was bringing a test, and as the creek began to swell, its gentle murmur transforming into a furious roar, she had the sinking feeling that her answer to that test would change Oakhaven forever. The dawn that broke over Oakhaven was not gentle. It was a stark, gray light that clawed its way over the eastern ridges, illuminating a world holding its breath. Every villager was awake, their fear a palpable hum in the cold morning air. They weren't huddled in their homes, but gathered in tents, silent clusters near the village square, their eyes fixed on the path leading from the Whispering Creek. Alara stood beside Boren on the crude wooden watchtower at the village edge. The wind whipped strands of her hair across her face, cold and sharp like the anxiety twisting in her gut. She had told them what Lyra had said, that her people were coming. She had omitted the part about them being warriors, fearing it would only sow more panic. Boren knew. He hadn't slept, his face a mask of granite, his hand resting on the hilt of his long knife. He hadn't blamed her, not with words, but his silence was a heavy shroud. Then they appeared. Not as a scattered, desperate band, but as a disciplined column cresting the hill where the storm had felled the ancient oak. There were 30 of them, moving with a quiet purpose that was far more intimidating than any savage roar. At their head, walking with a newfound strength, was Lyra. Her injuries were bound, but she moved with the authority of a leader. They weren't raiders, they were soldiers. "Sound the alarm," Boren said, his voice a low growl. The horn blew, a mournful sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through the villagers below. Oak Haven's 10 hunters, armed with bows and axes, formed a grim, wavering line before the gate. It was a pathetic defense against such a force. Ilara scrambled down the ladder, her heart pounding. This was not what she had envisioned. She ran to the front line just as Lyra's party came to a halt 50 yards away. The tension was a physical force, pressing in on them all. Lyra took a step forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Boren of Oakhaven," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "I am Lyra of Silverwood. We have not come to harm you." Boren stepped past his men, his stance aggressive. "Your actions speak louder than your words, woman. You come with an army at your back." "This is not an army," Lyra countered, gesturing to the grim-faced men and women behind her. "This is a shield. It is all that is left of my people's protectors. We were driven from our home by a man named Kale, a butcher who takes what he wants and burns the rest. We have been hunted for weeks. We seek only shelter and alliance." Her words hung in the air, a desperate plea cloaked in dignity. The villagers murmured, their fear warring with a flicker of understanding. Before Boren could respond, a frantic shout erupted from the far side of the village, from a scout perched in the high branches of a pine. Riders approaching from the south, they carry the banner of the snarling wolf. Lyra's face went pale. Kale! A new kind of fear, sharp and immediate, cut through the standoff. From the woods to the south, a dozen figures on horseback emerged, their appearance matching every nightmare Oakhaven had ever harbored about outsiders. They were ragged and wild, their armor a mismatch of leather and stolen iron, and they rode with a brutal abandon. This was the true threat, raw, undisciplined, and hungry for violence. The choice was gone. The world had narrowed to this single, terrifying moment. Kale's men let out a unified war cry and spurred their horses into a charge directly toward the village. Boren didn't hesitate. He looked at Lyra's warriors, their stances already shifting to face the new enemy. He saw their disciplined readiness, a stark contrast to the chaotic savagery of the approaching raiders. He looked at Ilara, who stood her ground, her face pale but resolute. In that instant, his entire worldview, built on a foundation of isolation and suspicion, cracked. Survival was not about building higher walls, it was about choosing the right allies. "With us," Boren roared, his voice cutting through the panic. He spun to his own men. "To the barricades! Archers, your marks!" He turned to Lyra's lead warrior, a tall woman with a scarred face. "They will funnel through the main path. Your spears will hold the line. My hunters will strike from the flanks." The warrior nodded, a flash of respect in her eyes. "As you command." The two groups, strangers only moments before, merged into a single defensive front. The battle was a maelstrom of desperate courage. Lyra's warriors formed a phalanx of shields and spears, a living wall that met the raiders' charge with unyielding steel. Boren and his hunters, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, darted between trees and cottages, their arrows finding gaps in the enemy's crude armor. The clash of metal, the shouts of men, and the screams of the wounded filled the air. Ilara did not run. She did not hide. Tearing strips from her own cloak, she moved behind the fighting line, her medical pouch slapping against her hip. She saw one of Boren's youngest hunters, a boy named Finn, go down with an arrow in his shoulder. Without a thought for her own safety, she rushed to his side, dragging him behind the cover of a woodpile. Her fingers, nimble and sure, assessed the wound, packed it with moss to staunch the bleeding, and bound it tightly. Her calmness was an island in the sea of chaos. From the thick of the fight, Boren saw her. He saw her tending to Finn, her face smudged with dirt and blood, her expression one of pure, focused compassion. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a weakness. Her strength, so different from his own, was the glue holding them together, reminding them what they were fighting for. It was a strength that healed, that preserved, that built. And he finally, truly understood. The battle turned. The combined discipline of Lyra's guard and the guerrilla tactics of Boren's hunters were too much for Kale's disorganized raiders. Broken and demoralized, they fled back into the woods, leaving their dead and wounded behind. A cheer, ragged and exhausted, rose from the defenders. A week later, the sun shone warmly on a village transformed. The scent of pine and fresh-cut lumber replaced the stench of fear. Near the creek, the people of Oak Haven and the survivors of Silverwood worked side by side, felling trees to expand the village, their children playing together in the meadows. The Whispering Creek, once a barrier, was now the heart of a new, larger community. A sturdy bridge was already under construction. Elara was in her garden, tending to the herbs that had saved so many lives. She looked up as Boren approached. He stopped before her, his usual grim expression softened by something she had never seen before. Humility. "The council has agreed," he said, his voice quiet. "Lyra's people will join us. We will build a new town together, Oak Haven Silverwood." Elara smiled faintly. "That's good news, Boren." He looked at his hands, then met her gaze. "I was wrong, Elara, about everything. My strength is in my arm and my knife. It can protect, but it can't build. It can end a threat, but it can't create a future." He gestured to the bustling activity around them. "Your strength did this. The compassion I called a weakness, it saved us all. It didn't just save Lyra, it saved Oak Haven from itself." He offered a rare, small smile. "Thank you." Elara's heart felt full. She looked past him, to the bridge taking shape over the water. One small act of kindness, one decision to reach across a dangerous current, had not invited destruction. It had delivered salvation. It brought 30 warriors not to conquer, but to defend. It had brought friends, neighbors, and a future she never could have imagined. And in the warm afternoon light, Oak Haven was, for the first time, truly safe.